thank you all for coming, and all of my old friends and new friends and art lovers and music lovers and wine and sandwich lovers. I'm glad you have some wine. I'm sure the art will improve as will the talk. So sip away, please. I want to speak a little bit about art in general and about some of these pieces specifically this afternoon. It's difficult to talk about our own work. Artists will tell you that, composers will tell you that. My years when I was a composer, there was a group called Meet the Composer. And we get a small grant, we go to a concert and give a little talk before the concert. And invariably, me included, the composers will be, it's difficult to speak about what we do, but I'll give it a shot anyhow. And I think one of the reasons is that visual art and instrumental music anyway are non-verbal, almost pre-verbal, dealing with emotions and feelings and all of those sorts of things and memories for which there are no words. And it's not just music. I mean, it's not just art. I'm getting a little confused because I used to do both. But it's not just visual arts, it's music. Gustav Mahler once said, if I could express what I have to express in some other way with words or something, I would, because writing music, he said, is so damn hard. So I think it's the same in the visual arts. It's difficult, but I'll give it a shot. And I may refer to some of my notes in this little catalog. There's also a binder up there talking about some of these pieces, a little paragraph of each one. I'll begin talking about these 4 black and red pieces here, which I did this past early summer. And they're kind of variations on the same sort of a thing. Variations on a big gestural mark, and then quite the opposite, very kind of restrained couple of rectangles, black and red, just black and red. And these sort of calligraphic gestures are scribed into the wet paint. Most usually in this piece and the one that Eric is standing behind, with the end of a paint stirrer. You get paint from Home Depot, they give you a wooden stirrer. So I use the back end of that to write into the wet paint. I think in pottery it's sgraffito, right? Same idea. The first piece back here is called Red Letter Day. Now I would say that all of these pieces were made before the titles arrived. So the titles I scrambled around, and in fact I was going to number them, but people expect titles, so I came up with the title. So the Red Letter Day concept comes from the sort of calligraphic element on the top, and Red Letter Day is, it's a very special day, and to me any day in the studio is a Red Letter Day, so I enjoy going to the art studio. So that's the sort of genesis of that title. The second one is called Red Does What It Wants. And when when I'm working on a painting, if I have an idea for something that's very specific, and if I try to impose it on the canvas or the collage, whatever it happens to be, it invariably does not work. So what I've discovered over time is I have to let the marks on the canvas or the paper tell me what it needs next. So in this case, the red needed to go down as opposed to against the black rectangle here, and also just the red over here without the swooping sound. So the red did what it needed to do. I mean, I didn't impose myself on it, I let it say, but I sat there and said, let's see, what does that need, or what's it telling me? And after a fashion, it told me. And so I did it quickly. Cy Twombly, the painter, once said, I think slow, but I paint fast. So I think that goes on here. This particular piece is a reference to my wife Margaret and myself. When life gets a little confused or complicated, I'll just say to Margaret, well, I'm just a simple country boy from Connecticut. And she doesn't believe a word of that except for the Connecticut part. But it's a little complicated, but the fact that it's just black and red, well, and white, it helps simplify the painting somewhat. And this final one, what's this final one? I have to remember. I'm going to read you this one. This is called Stonehenge. And it comes from a quote of Robert Motherwell. I'm going to read you the quote. He says, "The large format, speaking of painting, at one blow, destroyed the century-long tendency of the French to domesticate modern painting, to make it intimate." He goes on to say, we replaced the new girl in the French door with a modern Stonehenge, with a sense of the sublime and the tragic that had not existed since Goya and Turner." That's Robert Motherwell. So hence, Stonehenge. And I worked on these 4 paintings, and then I was working on a 5th one, this yellow one back here, which started out just to be black, but it needed, once again, I didn't decide, but it sort of decided for me. It needed the yellow, it needed the greenish blue background, and it needed, again, the 2 rectangles, which are taken from here, but they're blue and orange. And so that's how that piece came about. It started out to be black and red, but it ended up being like that. And that happens sometimes. And in giving this a title, I was reading some poetry by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And one of his long poems begins, "I am leading a quiet life in Mike's place," a bar on the Lower East Side. Then he goes on to describe the craziness and all the hectic things going on in the world and in his life. And each stanza begins, "I'm leading a quiet life in Mike's place." So this painting, a quiet life. It's not so quiet, but it's a bit of a oxymoron, perhaps. So those are that group of paintings. I refer to my notes again. So I did manage to say a few words, even though I said I couldn't. I remember I was speaking to my mother about talking and growing up. This was some years ago before she passed away. We don't have that connection now. But she said, when you were little, you didn't mumble, you didn't talk gibberish. The first words you said came out as a complete sentence. Wow, I don't know what that means exactly. But I was, I guess, maybe a cautious fellow in those days. And also back then I was much older than I am now. So these days I'm less cautious, as you can see, and maybe a bit younger than then, both. Some of you may not know that my background before visual arts is in the world of music. And that took some time to go from being a composer and a performer and sometimes conductor to doing the visual arts. In fact, some of these collages here, and the one up front, have actual music in them. A Bach prelude, the first one from the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was the only piece I could play at the piano as a music student. I was a one note at a time kind of guy, playing the clarinet and saxophone. So I had a tough time with the piano, but I could play that. And I remember learning about Bach's music, well, first in high school, but then in college. In high school, I was in a music theory class, and every day the teacher would have us sight sing a Bach chorale. Not the words necessarily, just the tones. And there were over 500 of them. So we met 3 days a week. We never repeated any of them. And then we'd sing it, and then he'd talk about the harmony going on. We have a harmony lesson. And then in college, I took a counterpoint class, how to write counterpoint in the style of Bach. I had a very difficult time. And the teacher finally called me into his office. He said, "What's going on there?" I said, "Well, I'm really having a tough time." And he said, "You know, you're never going to do it better than Bach. So give that up. Just try to figure out what he was doing." And then it became easier. So I was intimidated by Bach in the way that I think Brahms was intimidated by Beethoven, and visual artists are all intimidated by everybody from Picasso to Rembrandt and you name it. But once you figure out, okay, they're them and I'm me, and then it becomes a little bit easier anyhow. And the transition from music to visual arts was rather gradual. And I began to see that there were some similarities between the two. Composers and painters both work with arrangement of materials. So that's a similarity. But the difference is that in music, the composer arranges sounds and pitches and instrumental sounds and tone colors and rhythms over time, beginning to end. Whereas the visual arts, we're arranging shapes and colors in space. So that's one of the differences. And I think another big difference is that a music composition, a piece of music, is a prescription. It tells the players what notes to play, how loud to play them, when to play them, and it's a prescription and a description of what will happen when the players follow the prescription. So it's not a piece of music. We can argue with the aesthetics of this and the ideas of it, but a piece of music on a piece of paper is just a prescription. When it's played, then it starts to exist. Whereas here, in the visual arts, at least this is my thought about it anyway, it's a history, it's an historic record of what was done in the art studio. So on the one hand, it's a prescription of what to do. On the other hand, it's a description or a historical record of what has been done. We think of painting and visual arts as being painting, sculpture, drawing, collage. It was Helen Frankenthaler, one of the great 20th century artists. I may have the quote, I think I have it right anyway. She said, art is an activity, the results of which are the thing you hang on the wall. But art is the activity. So it's a little different than what some of us think about art. I mentioned earlier Cy Twombly, beginning with, I think slow, paint fast. Over here, I don't know if you can see this thing as I'm away. I have these red and black paints, 3 of them. And in each case, I wanted to have this idea of kind of opening the door and having a different kind of approach to my painting. So I took the phrase, opening the door, and I literally wrote with my paintbrush different kinds of red, opening the door, over and over again. Same over here, and a little bit up here, but it's harder to see. So it resulted in a visual construct that I never would have come up with otherwise. So the words themselves determine how the brush stroke went in all 3 of these cases. Once again, I did have a preconceived idea. I didn't know how it was going to look, but I did have an idea of how I might proceed. So that's sort of how that worked for me. And as with these, and also with the collages, which you'll see, it's hard to see sitting down, but if you walk around, you'll see some of them. Some of them have only a few elements in them. And I was saying to, I think it was Carol, about the composer, I'm going to blank out on his name now, from Preston, Roger Sessions, wrote very complicated music for some. But he quoted or paraphrased Einstein, who said, everything should be made as simply as possible, but no simpler. So therein is the edge that we sit on. How simple do we make it, or is it too complicated? And when do we stop? Well, I stop when if I add something else, it's going to be too complicated, or if I take something away, it's not finished. I can't really explain it any other way than that. But I think that little quote of Einstein is kind of operating in the back of my head. I try to make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And with Stravinsky, also talking about music again, Stravinsky once said, made a comment about, I try to write music that's very simple, but not simplistic and not simple-minded. And he certainly accomplished that. Some of it more complicated than some of the others, but still. I mentioned earlier that the titles of these pieces came afterwards. I was doing a number of them. They work for Haydn symphonies, number 100, number 1, number 104. But they're very powerful, emotional pieces, even so they're numbered. But with these 3 pieces, I did start out with something in mind, in a generic sort of way. If you're sitting behind me, you can look later at these 3 blue pieces. I was thinking about the times that Margaret and I, where'd you go? Oh, there we were over back there. Margaret and I, we had a small sailboat, And for a number of years, we sailed all along Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And often from Block Island, which is off of Newport, going east to a little island called Cuttyhunk Island off of Martha's Vineyard, about a 30-mile trip. And on a small sailboat, that's about 6 hours. And if the wind's coming at you, it's a kind of a hairy ride. And if it's behind you, you don't notice the wind until you turn to go to the harbor, then it blows like hell. So, the point is, it's 6 hours, 5 hours and change on a small sailboat. And you turn the corner to go into Cuttyhunk Harbor, and it's like, oh, we made it. It's calm, it's welcoming. We just spend the evening and we don't have to worry about the weather being bad, or even if it is, we're safe. So these three pieces are kind of, that's what I had in mind when I was doing these three collages. In fact, one of them is called Entering Cuttyhunk Harbor. This one is called Safe Harbor, and the other one is Red Right Return. I think my only sort of nod or bow to representational work are the little red rectangle in each of these, referring to the red buoy that marks the entrance of the harbor. And when you're sailing, you keep the red one on the right, so you don't come up on the rocks by mistake. But that's when these three came about. And so I just call them three nocturnes. But the idea started out was, okay, I'm sailing to Cuttyhunk, it's going to be calm when we get there. But then the work took over. The collage took over. These little shapes took over. This, took over. I just stopped thinking about sailing a boat. I was busy gluing stuff down. So once we get going, the material takes over. And I think it's the same whether it's music that we're writing, or whether it's visual arts, or the drama's a little different. I think in those two cases it's similar. Let me just check my little notes here. Oh yes, talking about what art means. Well, I'm not sure. I think for each of these paintings, each of these pieces, you might have a different reaction to the piece than you, or different than me, or yours is different than anyone else's. And whatever it means to you is what it means. And once again, there may not be any words to describe that. I mean, people, and we're familiar with this, people will write on and on about what, especially a piece of abstract painting means. And it could have saved a lot of ink, basically. That's just my feeling about it. Aaron Copeland once was asked about a specific piece. He said, well, what does the person asked interviewing him? Said, what does this piece mean? He said, well, it really has a lot of meaning. I just don't know what it is. So with that, I will ask if you have any questions about any of these pieces, you can ask them now, and I'll see what I can do to answer. I don't even know how long I've spoken, but it doesn't matter. Yes?
Preston, I have a question.
Right.
I was curious on your red letter series. Did you always set out to do 4?
No.
Okay.
No, I did not set out to do 4. I was doing 5, and that one ended up being yellow, orange, and blue.
Okay.
And I was going to do more, but then I had a commission to do a large piece for a building in Washington, D.C. in the middle of July. It had to be done by the middle of August, which it was. It's been delivered, as far as I know, it's being installed in a week or so. So I had to stop working on those to do the commission, and then stop working on that to figure out which of these paintings and collages to put up in this exhibit. So, no, I didn't start out to do 4, but it worked out. I need a bigger gallery if I had more. In fact, the hardest thing of putting this show together was what to leave out. Stuart and Barbara were in my studio, I think it was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And once that hit, I set up a little studio at home. I recorded my radio program in the morning, turned my chair around and do little collages on this table in the afternoon, and I did hundreds of them. And I just kept on going, and when I got back in my studio, I just kept on going. So, like I said, the hard part was deciding which pieces to include. Anybody? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, how do you choose red and black? I assume the white, you paint the canvas white first.
No.
No?
The white is it's a pre-primed canvas.
Uh-huh.
The white is gesso. It's not white that I applied, which I could have.
Yeah.
Then it would have looked more like, I don't know, somebody else. Cy Trombly did that, for example. A lot of the white in his back paintings are not just white, but lots of overworking, scratching, and from a distance it was just white. No, just white, and then black. I was just going to do black and white. It needs something. And I had some earlier little collages about that size, which were black with a little bit of red. And I used those, not to copy them here, but I used them as kind of a reference. I saw that, how would that look if I did it bigger? And not exactly like that, but if I had the swooping marks and some couple of rectangles as a contrast. So that's where that came from. I mean, I could have used other colors, but the initial sketches were black and red, so that was it. All right. Barb?
That was my question. Do you do a sketch or not?
No, I don't. It might be easier if I did, but I don't. I mean, I'll start with just a mark, a brush mark, or if it's a collage, a couple of things together. I need at least two to talk to each other. And then I'll say, okay, now what else? Now what does it need? What would happen if I did this? Or what would happen if I made that? Well, that red needed to come down in the swoop like that. So I did it. I don't do a sketch really. I mean, they're similar, right?
But you, in your head, so I'm gonna do big paintings?
Yes, I wanted to do big paintings. And that was that. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound easier than it is, but for example, the big swooping marks were made with a mason's trowel, which I have two. One is a foot long and one's 14 inches. So you load it up with paint and go like so. And then what? Well, I do something that's quite the opposite of that. A very controlled rectangle or scribing into the wet paint with some sort of a mark making tool of some kind. Yeah.
Were you aware when you were saying doing paintings, or was that something that happens back in the school?
I wasn't aware that I was going to do those, no. We stopped sailing back in almost 10 years ago. These were done maybe a year ago. But I used to do little oil paintings from the boat. We get, for example, I have some at home from Provincetown, from these various places we would sail to. And then gradually I started working in a more abstract way. And I don't use oils because they're smelly and they dry too slowly. So, yeah, Carol?
A question that also connects composers. Does the painting tell you when it's done?
Yeah.
It does?
Yes. Yeah. The painting tells me when it's done. And sometimes it's turning it upside down, sideways to see what's what, which not only is in the visual arts, but in music, in Bach's music, for example. The melody is played from beginning to end, then he plays sometimes from the end to the beginning, sometimes upside down, and backwards, which happens in the well-tempered clavier. There's a group of pieces called the Art of the Fugue, which is, how many, 30 pieces or something like that, maybe more, based on one subject. How many?
6 parts.
6 parts, yeah. All based on one melody. Upside down, backwards, longer, shorter. And that's how he holds it all together. So it's what do I leave out? Keep it simple, but not too simple. There's another question? Yeah.
Do you mix your colors on palette or on the painting, especially these three? Like the coral is so.
A little bit of both.
Oh, so it's good.
Well, yeah. I use, these are red, ochre, black, and white. 4 colors. Come in. Hey, Catherine. Yeah, I use 4 colors, red, we finished, red, black, white, and ochre for about 6 months. I did a lot of work using just those 4 colors. And it's amazing what you can do with those 4 colors.
So is it a cad red?
No, I don't know what it was. it's not purple, it's,
Well, not, I mean, like the one over here on the far right, like the, I like that kind of bluish, like the vertical marks. And then
Here?
No, yeah, right, in the red field, right,
there?
yeah.
That's
Maybe-
black.
Oh,
Actually,
it's
it's black.
black, okay, it's looking purple to me.
Yeah, sure, I mean, you know, what you see is what you get, but, well, I use primary colors basically, and I just mix them to get whatever combinations I want. Otherwise, you'd have 15 gazillion reds. So, we have any other questions? Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you all for coming, and thank you for putting up with what I have to say or didn't have to say. And a special thank you to my friend Jerry Moen, who's not here, and especially Margaret, my wife, who has put on probably more art exhibits and receptions than any of us, all of us in the room put together in her years at Forbes. So I couldn't have done this without her love and enthusiasm and support, so thank you. And thank you all for coming. Wine and sandwiches, and the art will look even better. It's more wine, so thank you.